So we'll start our session for today. Uh, Good evening. Welcome everyone to this very special session on understanding gender-based legal rights, organized by the School of Law, BML Munjal University. And I'm Urmi Gupta. I teach at the School of Law, BML Munjal University, and I'm in conversation with none other than Miss Jayna Kothari today. Welcome, Jayna, and thank you for joining us today. I'll briefly introduce Jayna to all of you. So, Ms. Jayna Kothari is a co-founder and executive director of Center for Law and Policy Research. She's a senior advocate and practices at the Supreme Court of India. She graduated from University Law College and read the BCL at Oxford University. Jayna's research and practice interests include constitutional law, gender and sexuality law, disability rights, and discrimination law. She had argued in the Supreme Court in the recent constitutional challenges to Section 377 and adultery, which were both decriminalized. She also argued the independent thought case in which the Supreme Court recognized child marital rape as a criminal offense. So welcome, Jayna, once again, and thank you for joining us. So yeah. So before we start our session today, I'll just like to give you an overview of what we are about to do. So for the first 45 minutes, we are just going to have a conversation, me and Jayna. And after that, we are going to take up questions for 15 minutes. We are going to have a question and answer session. So please feel free to post your questions, and I'm sure that Jayna will be elated to answer your questions. So, and also, if I may just point it out, that the theme for this year's International Women's Day is choose to challenge. So I hope we can all, this session should be the starting point for us to start challenging and questioning those norms and societal boundaries that it has been created to set up what is normal versus what is abnormal. So welcome, Jayna. And so I'll start with my first question, Jayna, which is in continuation with the challenge or rising up to the challenge that I was talking about. And the first question that I would like to ask is, what do you think about gender? Sometimes gender is just relegated to the exclusive sphere of women and just talking about women's rights. So is gender just about women? And what do you think? What are your comments on it? We would love to hear that.
Thank you, Urmi. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this program. It's a great honor to be part of the BML Munjal School of Law Women's Day program. So thank you for that. And I know that you've kind of curated a nice bunch of questions around the issue of challenging stereotypes. And yeah, I think your first question is very important. Should Women's Day, or when we talk about women, should today on March 8th we talk only about women? What do we mean by gender? Does gender refer only to women? And I would in fact say that we have to question what we mean by gender, and I think it's a great time to do that. And one of the some of my work on transgender rights actually helped me do that. My initial activism was from my college days just on the issue of women's rights. But it was only when I started working on gender identity issues and transgender rights that the whole world of sex and gender kind of opens up. And that's where I'd like to go back to some trans rights jurisprudence. So in the Nalsa judgment of 2014, the Supreme Court, when it first recognized transgender rights, actually laid down a very, very important principle that when we talk about sex discrimination under the Constitution, under Article 15, we have to see that sex includes gender. And instead of looking at sex, we have to talk about gender based discrimination, because sex is just your biological sex. You know, whether you're assigned male or you're assigned female. And it's a very binary notion, because the medical science just looks at what is male or female sex based on your body. But gender is far more than that. And gender is how you identify in your head. You know, you may be of any sex biologically, but your gender identity may be different. You may identify as male, you may identify as female, you may identify as other, you may identify as transgender, or anything in between. You may identify just as gender non-conforming or as queer. Um, and and a lot of our binary notions of sex, of men and women, are so tied up to gender roles that what do we mean by women? You know, women are supposed to wear feminine clothes, women are supposed to be at home, women are not, are not the bread earners, they are supposed to look after the family. So, all those kind of, they're supposed to be submissive, feminine, not loudmouth, not strong, and not all of that. And men have their own stereotyped gender roles. And so really a lot of the kind of debates around trans rights are really about breaking these social norms of the binary kind of norms of gender. And so I would say that, on Women's Day, of course, we are talking about women's equality, but a lot of women's equality is tied up so much about the roles, the gender based roles and norms. And we should use this to not talk just about the binary notions of sex, but talk about gender in its complete range, and encompass all issues, whether it relates to gender identity, gender non-conformity. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that the women's movement has always fought for is that women are not going to be, tied down by society's norms of what they're supposed to do. So I think, um, you know, kind of really talking about removing gender stereotypes will expand the issues, not just for women's rights, but to be more inclusive about trans rights, gender nonconformity, and all of that.
Thank you for answering that question. I think it's an eye opener for a lot of my students, because what happens in class, whenever I ask them about what is gender, this is the answer, that it is about women's rights, right? Maybe something to do with patriarchy or something. That's what women complain about. And it's something got to do with feminism, right? And even the distinction that you just asserted about gender and sex, this is so very important. And thank you for answering that so promptly. So another thing that I want to ask, and since you brought up the question of trans rights, I just want to ask one thing, that given that we have had legal reforms in the last few years, and considering that we have the Transgender Persons Protection Rights Act now, um, how how benefited will the transgenders be from this act? This is something, a constant question that I think I am puzzled with. That is this really emancipatory for the transgender persons? Because there were a lot of protests, if you remember, regarding when the bill was passed. There were a lot of protests, there were a lot of hue and cry regarding the bill, but still it was passed. What are your comments on that? How do you see that? Is that a reform, or we are again imposing stringent norms, those bodily and sexual norms on the transgender persons?
Yeah. So there was initially a big demand for a law to protect the rights of transgender persons, but the act that has been passed is highly, unsatisfactory. And many versions of the bill initially, prior to the act being passed, there were a lot of protests from the trans community. Even the current act that has been passed, there have been a lot of challenges in the Supreme Court. In fact, we filed a few challenges. There are other petitioners. So there is already a challenge to the constitutionality of this act in the Supreme Court. And one of the issues, really, one of the main issues, really, is that the law does not take into account the basic principles of self-determination of gender identity, which in fact is the core of the trans rights movement. So, going back to the Nalsa judgment, the Supreme Court had actually said that a person has the autonomy and the right to self-determine one's gender identity. And by self determining, it means that it is not dependent on medical reassignment. So, what that means in very layman's terms is that if I am born male, with sex assigned as male, but I identify myself as female, gender, then whether or not I undergo medical reassignment or hormonal treatment or any other form of therapy or treatment, uh, I should have the right, I should have the constitutional right to determine my own gender identity, because not everyone can afford medical reassignment. It's a very expensive process. It's also, in many cases, a risky process. It's a very long, elaborate process. So, a lot of people don't have access to it, are unable to afford it, and a lot of people may not want it because of so many risks and all of that involved. And but that shouldn't deprive a person of their inherent right to determine their gender identity. And what the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act does is that it doesn't recognize this principle. So one of the biggest challenges, or one of the biggest issues that the trans community has, is that there's a provision there which says that if you are recognized as a transgender person and you want to change your gender to male or female, then that can be done only after a medical certificate. That means after you have undergone medical reassignment, and that in fact violates the core principle, which is self-determination of gender identity. So that is one of the biggest problems, and that is a challenge. There are also other challenges to the other problems with the law. Under the criminal code, we have section 376, which is of rape. And there, 376 describes rape as an offense only when it is against a woman, where the victim is a woman. And currently, under the IPC, if a transgender person is sexually assaulted, there's no section, and therefore they don't have the remedy of criminal, even registering an FIR. And what the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act does is that it makes sexual assault a criminal offense against transgender persons, which is good, but the punishment prescribed is only 2 years, whereas in Section 376, it's 7 years or more, 10 years and up to life. And so the question is that why this discrepancy? Is sexual assault faced by trans persons less serious? Why should it be? And so there are many challenges and many problems with the legislation, and therefore, yeah, so there's pending a challenge in the courts.
And this is very interesting. And do you think that even after the Nirbhaya case and even after the Justice Verma Committee report, do you think that our understanding of rape, at least in legal framework, it is still under the rhetoric of peno-vaginal framework? Is that still the rhetoric, or is
It
that,
is,
yeah?
because even no, it still is. It's not changed that much. I mean, there is a little more openness because with the Navte judgment, Section 377 was decriminalized. And so there has been openness to LGBTQI issues, on transgender rights, and on same-sex relationships, but we still need the recognition by the law that the victim of sexual assault can be of any gender, and that hasn't happened yet. Even when the Verma committee was sitting, there were many representations that if you're using this opportunity to reform criminal law, then rape law should be reformed to make the victim gender neutral. The perpetrator can still be male because that is largely the case, but the victim should be gender neutral. But that wasn't accepted. And so now there is a big demand that the victim should be gender neutral, because otherwise there is no remedy for example, a transgender person who's being sexually assaulted, and the amount of sexual violence the trans community faces is immense, and there's no legal remedy. I think you're muted, sorry.
Yeah. Hopefully now it's fine.
Yeah.
So that's great to know. And also, I'm very interested to know that, of course, the impact of lockdown, now that we are facing this pandemic situation, it has been immense, it has been far reaching. Can you please tell us how the pandemic has affected women and the gender and sexual minorities? Is it same all across, or is it differentially treating the women and gender and sexual minorities?
Yeah. So there has been a lot written about the unequal kind of impact of the pandemic on different communities. Of course, women have borne the brunt of it, of the pandemic, the world over. Not just in India, the world over, because with the kind of extended lockdown, with people working from home, with children staying at home and doing schooling from home, basically the entire brunt of the home has fallen on women in all kind of societies. And if the women are working, then they have to manage their work and look after their kids who are at home, and look after the family, the husbands, in-laws, the food, the cleaning, and all of that. And in many cases, women have had to give up their jobs because they have not been able to do all of this, because the man has to work and the children have to kind of do their schooling and have to be supervised and all of that. The cases of domestic violence have gone up incredibly high, because what the lockdown did is that it wasn't in people were not able to go out, whether to work or even to leave the house. Especially in those days of the lockdown where there was no transport, no travel, nothing available. So this increased violence against women within the home, because they were actually confined to the homes and they had no escape. We've had cases where women were unable to even report physical abuse to the police, because they were unable to reach the police stations. And they had basically no other remedies. So in every way, mentally, physically, financially, emotionally, and sexually, the lockdown saw violence against women increasing. We've had so many cases of divorce, really culminating during the lockdown, because it just amplified the violence that women were facing, without any kind of escape or remedy. And I think this has been kind of reported by the UN and by CEDAW and many other international bodies as well. The National Commission of Women has also kind of reported on this. So that, of course, was there. And again, sexual and gender minorities, also there has been an increase in violence. I mean, I think the world over, what we saw is that COVID amplified inequalities that were there. And so all marginalized communities faced amplified discrimination during COVID. And so we at CLPR we brought out a report called Exclusion Amplified. It's there on our website, where we have examined the discrimination faced by gender and sexual minorities during COVID in India. And what our report highlights is that all the some of the biggest threats during the lockdown, the loss of livelihood, loss of access to food security. There were those initial 2 months or at least 1.5 months of lockdown where people didn't have food available. Migrants, we saw images of migrants moving, but what was happening is that a large number of the people excluded from even getting access to basic food were trans communities, were sex workers, were people on the streets earning a livelihood on the streets, and they were excluded because a lot of them didn't have ration cards to even get the free rations from ration shops. And they faced extreme loss of livelihood. I mean, a large number of the trans community is engaged in sex work and begging, and they were thrown off the streets. Even now, they are unable to get back any access to livelihood. There was a great increase in mental health concerns, because again, a lot of people from gender and sexual minorities due to the lockdown were forced to stay with their families in violent situations where they weren't able to be themselves in their chosen gender identity. And that led to suicides, increased mental health vulnerabilities. So, so of course, this has seen again a much higher increase of violence and discrimination against gender and sexual minorities.
Um, wow, and this actually reminds me of a recent article that you have written, where you have highlighted these problems and you're talking about and you're arguing for broadening our constitutional framework on how it is defining equality, and that the provisions right now on the right to equality is inadequate. So, if you can just elaborate on that a little bit for all of us.
Yeah. So, something I have been working on is um, re examining equality. How do we understand equality within our constitutional framework? And I think this COVID period has actually forced us or compelled us to re examine it, because our kind of existing framework of equality, though the framing of equality within our constitution is quite robust and is quite strong, I would still say that uh, it needs to be re-examined now, because our understanding, even though it kind of moved from formal equality to substantive equality, we have reservation and affirmative action and all of that. But what we saw in the past year during COVID, what we are witnessing even with gender and sexual minorities, with caste discrimination and all of that, is that it's not enough to just provide reservation or kind of say yes, substantive equality, and the government won't discriminate. Uh, what our understanding of equality also needs is that equality should mean freedom from violence, because a lot of very marginalized communities live with violence. And how do you ensure that someone has a life free of violence? And secondly, if you have to ensure that every person is able to participate equally in life, in society, either in public life or private life, then what is required is really the recognition of the dignity of every person, the equal worth of every person, and to recognize that every person has the right to dignity, whoever that person may be. And it doesn't matter if the person has a disability, it doesn't matter if the person's gender identity is different, it doesn't matter if the person is poor, is the what the caste of that person is, but the inherent dignity of every person. And how do we have a framework of equality that recognizes that equal worth? Because during COVID, we saw that some people were just not considered equal enough. And so they didn't have access to many of the things that are needed just to live a life of dignity, where you say basic life, one should have access to basic food, clothing, and shelter.
And that brings me to question that, what are rights? Sometimes we even think about, like now that you're talking about right to equality, even I can think about human rights, and there are different gradations of whom you're according to these rights to, right? So there are some people who are accorded rights, they are given rights, but there are some people who are not even recognized human enough to be provided rights, right? So this is a major concern. And moving on, I want to ask your understanding, since we are actually talking about equality and rights. I want to talk about your understanding on the current MTP amendment bill, and how far we are progressing on our rights of women, and a very simple issue, which is of course contentious for, like, we have been having this since antiquity, right? The safe access to abortion, right? Legal right to abortion of women. But we are facing certain problems, structural problems with this MTP amendment bill. And how do you see this amendment bill? Is this any kind of reform that you see, or again, this understanding of expert committee and then legal board and medical examination board that would come and regulate and say that, okay, this should be the gestation period, above this you're not allowed, or below this. So these dimensions I wanted you to explore and understand, make us understand about it.
Yeah. So the abortion rights issue has been a contentious issue, and in India, to some extent, I think at least our laws on abortion compared to other countries have comparatively been quite progressive. So we had the Medical Termination Pregnancy Act, which permits abortion up to 20 weeks. So that is one thing. But over the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of cases where women who need abortions or want abortions beyond the 20-week period have had to go to court because the MTP Act provides that if it is beyond 20 weeks, it can only be if it is to save the life of the woman, and doctors don't permit that, and then the woman has to go to court, and courts have what the courts have started doing, the Supreme Court, is that beyond 20 weeks, the courts have said that, well, on one hand, saving the life of the woman could be not just her physical life, but her mental well-being as well. But that can only be decided by a medical board that will examine the woman and the stage of her pregnancy and give a report. And so then you're giving this kind of control back from the woman, whose body it is and whose right and autonomy it should be to decide, to a medical board and then to the court. And so beyond 20 weeks, it's referred to a medical board. The medical board gives its report, and then based on that, the court will permit or not permit the woman to carry out an abortion. And though the amendment bill has been there, the amendment bill is looking at extending this 20 weeks time period to, I think, 24 weeks. But the debates really within the the women's rights movement has been that why should there be uh, any time period for termination of pregnancy? We've had cases where in emergency cases, even up to 30 weeks, women have gone to court and sought for abortions. In some cases, the courts have granted, in some did not. Often you find that uh, women don't even have access to doctors or to medical care very early on, due to which they are unable to take unable to even get proper medical advice. And by the time they decide or get any advice, even to decide whether to terminate or not, it's about 30 weeks. It has happened, it's not uncommon. And if it is safe to abort, then why should there be a limit? And so these are many of the debates and questions being raised. So I feel that even the even the MTP amendment bill, if we're just looking at, extending the period of abortion from 20 weeks to 24 weeks, I mean, I don't think that's enough. We need to really use an amendment to kind of talk about the rights to autonomy and bodily integrity. What does it mean? Does the MTP Act need an overhaul? Though the Act, does not in any place say that, a married woman who wants an abortion needs the permission of her husband. In practice, that is what happens. In practice, often when women go to health professionals and ask for an abortion, and they're asked, "Are you married? Is your husband consenting?" If there's a minor who's under 18, it's almost impossible that she will get an abortion if she needs it. So there are so many issues that I don't think it's just a question of extending the time. I think if we really want to talk about the right to bodily integrity and autonomy as part of women's reproductive rights, then we have to address all these issues. Whether just it would be so not just in the context of extending the time frame for an abortion.
That's very interesting because you see, um, for certain abnormalities with the fetus, that actually allows you to even like go beyond the gestation period, like of that limit, 23 weeks or 24 weeks, and then abort. Then that means that there is kind of socio-political norms which are attached to this whole amendment process, that where it is trying to regulate the bodies of women. And of course, even as we saw with the Transgender Protection Act, even you have to get a certificate, you have to go for a physical examination, right, to get that certificate, to tell that, okay, to tell the world that, okay, I am a transgender. But my problem is that in this age, when we are talking about autonomy, we are talking about championing women's rights and then gay rights. Where does our like bodily autonomy lie? Like, is it there, or is it just absolutely negligent? Like everything is disappears in thin air, I feel, when it comes to legislation, when it comes to legal reforms.
Yeah. So these are, I mean, this is an important part in the challenge to the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. And one of the things in that is that there should be, the change of gender from transgender to male or female can only be done by a medical certificate and if the district magistrate is satisfied with that medical certificate, and there could be other requirements as well. And even till now, if you see in many states where transgender identity cards are given by state governments, they have a screening committee where trans persons are physically examined in many cases where trans persons have their gender change in their passports, for example, and they're traveling, they are examined at airports, etc. So, and the question asked by, there was a question asked by one trans activist at one of these conversations we were having, is that, if you write female on your ID card, does anybody question that and say, let me see how a female you are, I want to physically examine you? No. If a cis person writes female or male, their gender identity is not questioned and they are not physically examined, right? uh, if I say that I'm female, nobody will say, well, we need to physically examine you. So, why is it that for trans persons you need a physical examination? Because our whole, if we're saying that the principle of self determination of gender identity is based on self determination, then why should it matter what your bodies are? Why should it matter, right? And the recognition that such physical examination, or putting your decisions of such an intimate and private nature, if we're talking about the right to privacy, the decisions of such intimate personal nature is again given to, say, an expert committee or a medical board. For example, even in the case of abortion, uh, takes away a person's autonomy and privacy, right? And so all of those issues arise, and that's why many of these issues are questioned. Includes the issue of screening committees and the transgender persons. Of course, now the screening committee is not there, but in the previous version of the bill, it was there. Now the screening committee is removed, but the medical certificate requirement is there. In abortion, the medical board is there, and all of that is basically taking away your autonomy and ensuring that some other expert decides what you are, and not you yourself.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant analysis. Also, I would like to know, and I think the audience also would like to know about what is like how does law see consent? Because even consent, the idea of consent, it is very contentious, right? Even sometimes we are confused within the terrains of yes, no, and maybe. Now, how does law look at the objectivity of what consent is? So this is something very fascinating, and this is something that I've always tried to look at, but never found the clear answer. And maybe you can talk a little about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, consent has become, obviously now. I mean, it shouldn't be a matter of debate. I think if we just were to say what is the meaning of consent, it's quite simple, right? Consent is yes, whether you give your consent or you don't give your consent to any act or to anything. But we've seen how consent is being kind of twisted by the law uh, to mean something completely different from what an ordinary understanding of consent would be. So we see that in sexual assault, in rape cases, consent is not seen as whether the woman gave her consent or not to the act, but oh, she didn't protest, so therefore it's consent. We've seen cases like that, right? Oh, there are no physical marks on her body of struggle. Oh, there are no marks on there are no signs of struggle in the room. Nothing's broken, nothing's injured, nothing is kind of, clothes are not torn, so therefore it's consent. So she must have consented, because there were no signs of struggle. There were no signs of her not consenting. So, we've moved from an ordinary, even a child would say, that did you consent? Did you say yes? I mean, a simple answer is Did I say yes? It doesn't matter whether but it's been twisted in our cases to say, well, you didn't say no, you didn't say no strongly enough, you didn't say no loudly enough, and that means it's a yes, you know? And so, the constant battle is to reaffirm that consent is, there is no consent unless the person actually says, yes, I want to do this. Apart from that, everything else means there's no consent. And I think, I mean, it's hard in the law to do that, because we've seen, we read, we did a at CLPR, we did a report, I think 3 years back in 2015, many years back, 5 years back, I think in 2015, where we studied after the Nirbhaya case, where special fast track courts were set up all over the country, um, to specifically address, take up cases of rape and POXO. Not only were they special courts, but they were special fast track courts. And we studied in Karnataka all the cases in 1 year, in that first year that these special fast track courts were set up. And we found that that report is also available online, and we found that the conviction rate of these special courts, which were just for sexual assault cases, was only about 7% conviction rate. I mean, and the average conviction rate of all crimes is about 18%. So our special courts for sexual assault were actually performing worse than regular average general criminal courts. And we read the judgments because, to qualitatively understand what were the findings and why they were acquitting the accused. And in many of the cases, the reasonings were like this. There was a case where a woman was raped by her neighbor, and was raped in her house. And the court said that none of the neighbors heard any screams. So that means there was no opposition. That means she consented. Things like that. So how do we, reaffirm that consent is not by absence? Consent should be by active affirmation. Unless it is there, nothing else is consent. You know.
Wow, this is quite this is great that consent is not defined as the absence, right? This is absolutely great. Now I see several questions from the audience, and I think we can go to these questions. I'm sure they're interesting. So Harshita Tyagi is asking, ma'am, do you agree with Simone de Beauvoir when she said that one is not born but is made a woman? Why or why not?
Yeah, I would agree that, I mean, our definition and our understanding again of gender is changing, right? I mean, today, if we see, what like a very well-known activist, trans activist whom I've worked very closely, often asks that what makes a woman? The fact that you have a vagina or female body parts, is that what makes a woman? Not necessarily, you the principles of gender identity says that, well, you can decide if you feel like a woman, if you identify as a woman. So I don't think it's about being born as a woman, but you can decide what you want to be.
Right. And Harshita, this is something that Jayna just answered in her first question when she was like distinguishing between sex and gender. So, yeah. So hopefully we can move on to the next question. So student is asking, we talk about emancipation, liberation, and gender identity, yet we see the state intervening and giving recognition to people. What, according to you, is the cause of this with context to India?
So you see the state intervening and giving recognition to people.
Yeah.
Well, the I would say that I don't think it's about the state giving recognition, um, but it is, if we talk about gender identity and self determination, it's the principle of self determination. And what the court has recognized in the Nalsa judgment is that you have the right to self determine your gender identity. And the state is therefore not giving you any recognition, but the state is just affirming that you have, I mean, the state is just kind of confirming that yes, your gender identity is what you self determine. So I would therefore say it's not the state giving you recognition, but you determine your gender identity yourself, and then you get a legal document to ensure that you can exercise your legal rights with your chosen gender identity.
Harshit Manwani has asked, one thing I witnessed in my school years was that there was hardly any discussion about transgenders. Till the time we were in school, we were not comfortable talking about them. Do you think that school curriculum should include transgender rights as well?
Yes, I definitely think that the school curriculum should include discussions and material on transgender rights, gender nonconformity, sexuality, because you do realize that when children, young people are growing up, that's when many of these issues come up, right? Gender nonconformity, whether you identify with the sex assigned or not. You are also realizing or discovering your own sexuality and your own identity. So, and often we find that many young people, young children, also have a lot of questions, but they are not sure. They don't know who to turn to. So, and it's at that time, I mean, this should just be a part of the school curriculum. I think to some extent is being introduced by, I think, the NEP, but I'm not sure to what extent. So I think all of this should be part of school curriculum for sure.
Great. So, another student is asking, ma'am, as much as I believe and support the concept of choice, and that if a woman wishes to be a homemaker, then she should. However, since a homemaker's job is a non economic activity, it deters women from achieving financial independence. What do you feel about the viability of giving a monetary value to a homemaker's job?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of recent debate about it, right? That should women at home be given, should there be a monetary value attached? Should they be given, a monthly payment, etc. Um, I mean, I personally, I don't think that there definitely is a monetary value attached to it because, I mean, I don't think it's easy to kind of come up with a monetary value, but a woman's job in the home definitely allows others in the home to go out and work if she's not working, and therefore it enables the increase of monetary income and value by the husband, right? Because she's doing everything for him, enabling him to go out and work and come back and have the home looked after, kids looked after. So it enables the economic earnings of others in the house. But I don't I think attaching a monetary value is complicated. But I think what has been done interestingly in a few cases is that, for example, in some cases, courts have uh, tried to value and put some monetary value. For example, in a case of the Madras High Court, where I think there was a case of, a death, a motor vehicles accident, and the woman was a housewife. The judge said, well, that doesn't mean she's not earning, and we'll have to monetize it so that you can get compensation. So in other cases, I think even in matrimonial disputes, if you're looking at alimony or custody, etc., just because a woman is not working and is at home, I think there have been cases where her contributions have been valued. So yeah, we need to ensure recognize that being at home is not working, you know. But I think the viability of putting a monetary value is not easy. It's complicated. That's all I can say.
Sure. The next question is from Mihika Mukherjee. She's asking, ma'am, very recently the Supreme Court of India has been criticized for asking, I think she's talking about the CJI,
Yeah.
a man accused of rape to marry his victim. Although the CJI has denied the fact that any such statements were made, what are your views on the incident? Many now feel that the apex court is faltering in its duty. So, what are your comments?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that question should have been asked at all, whether, he's willing to marry the victim. And I mean, whatever, whether it is in the facts of that case or, I don't think it matters at all. I mean, it's a case of bail. Why should it matter? And why should a judge ask the accused, are you going to marry the victim? Which kind of means that if you marry the victim, then it's all solved. Your rape, your sexual assault is wiped away. So I mean, whatever the facts may be, we can't be kind of asking such questions or even kind of addressing rape like that. You're trivializing sexual assault, you're trivializing rape, you're approving violence in a relationship. You're basically saying that, he's raped someone that, and now he can marry her. And she will want to be with him, with someone who's raped her. You know, you're basically saying that violence is okay in a marriage or in a relationship. And so there's a huge problem. And, our judges are public figures, cannot be making statements like that. That's it. I mean, and I'm glad that there was such an outrage, because I think in the future, hopefully, people will not make such statements.
Absolutely. Um, Devansh Sharma is asking, the Transgender Act 2019 says that the transgenders can get separated from their family only after an order is passed by the court. How just do you think this law is?
Yeah, this is one of the other provisions of the act where there's a lot of opposition, because it says that, a minor who wants to leave his or her family can only do so after a court order. And the reality in the lives of a lot of young gender non-conforming children, young transgender persons, is that often they face a lot of violence from their homes, from their family members, and they're forced to run away from home, because of the violence they're facing. And now, if the law says that you can only leave your family by a court order, that means they are going to be trapped in violent families. Where is a young person going to go and get legal help to go and get a court order? All that's going to be extremely difficult. And that's not the reality and the real life experience of young trans or gender non-conforming persons, and that is one of the big issues, one of the issues with the act as well.
Great. I think we are done with all the questions from the audience. I think I would just like to ask just one more question. So, you have worked a lot on the issues of disability and you have worked on anti discrimination, disability law. So, I just want to know that, when we are thinking about legal reforms, do these questions of women, gender, sexual minorities, when we are thinking about these different identities, do we think of taking these intersections of disability, race, religion, caste into account while making these laws?
I think our laws don't take into account these intersectionalities, and that is one of the serious concerns. I mean, when we talk about disability rights, how often do we talk about the rights of women with disabilities? How often do we talk about the rights of trans persons with disabilities, or lesbian women with disabilities? And how often do we talk of all other intersections of women in caste and women in religion? And you find that unless you ask the questions of intersection at the intersections, unless you address the issues at the intersections, it's often the issues at the intersections that are the most heightened. So while you may talk about issues of persons with disabilities, say their discrimination they face in getting government employment, the challenges that women with disabilities face in getting government employment is much more, you know and so our laws have to address the intersections, because uh, people don't experience discrimination just as one identity, right? Uh, we all have so many multiple identities that we embody, and what we experience is because of all the different identities that that people have. It's never just as one thing. You may face discrimination, not just because you're a woman, but because you're a woman from a particular community, from a particular language speaking, because you've married someone, because you went to you're maybe from a small town, rural, urban, so many different identities and experiences we have, and we face discrimination because of a complex intersection of all of that. And the challenge is that how do we ensure that the law responds to these intersections? It's not easy, but we have to at least work towards that.
Try at least, right? At least start talking about it. That's the start of it, right? And with this, we end our discussion. And what a fascinating discussion, Jana. It was amazing. In fact, I would say it was revolutionary. So I think it was a great starting point for all our students who were patiently listening to us. So that's great. And thank you, Jenna, once again, and wishing you a very happy International Women's Day. Hope you had a very good day and have a great evening ahead. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Urmi, and wish you all a very happy International Women's Day too. And thanks for all the fun questions.
Thank you so much for the lovely answers. They were amazing.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Great conversation. Thank you once again. Bye bye, everyone. Enjoy your evening.
Bye.
Bye bye.